In this episode of the Anti-Library podcast, we will talk about the role Atlantic slavery and scientific racism played in shaping the curriculum of medical schools in the antebellum US that continues to influence the present. We have with us Dr. Christopher Willoughby, Assistant Professor of African American and Africa Diaspora Studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a visiting fellow in the University of Pennsylvania study Pain Medicine and the Afterlives of Slavery. His influential work, the monograph Masters of Health, Racial Science and Slavery in US Medical Schools, meticulously details how antebellum medical faculty, often in medical schools in the North that included sizable Southern students, systematically promoted theories of biological racial difference, such as polygenesis, which were often supported by the exploitation of black bodies, both alive and deceased, for experimentation and anatomical study. He also co-edited the book Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery. As co-discussant, I am lucky to have my friend Dr. Bernardo Moreno Peniche, a medical doctor turned medical anthropologist who is currently a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. He researches on the Chagas disease, often associated with human migration from Latin America, despite growing evidence of local transmission cycles that have continuously been part of US landscapes. Without further ado, let's go to Chris and Bart research today. So, my first question is about how did you come up with this idea? So, your work kind of shows, um, all these different transnational connections. On the one hand, the way you define the clinical racial gaze, where two different ways of looking at bodies get fused. The anatomical vision of the Parisian hospital and that of the slave market. So, how did you come up with this kind of exciting topic and these transnational connections?
So first, thanks so much for having me. It's a great question, and it's one of those things that when you're so I'm a trained as a historian of slavery who kind of became a historian of medicine. So I was very much in graduate school reading particularly Walter Johnson's book Soul by Soul: Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market. I mean, I might have slightly missed the title there, but roughly speaking, and he talked about the ways that when enslavers and slave purchasers went into these markets, they were kind of reading outsides of bodies, but for an understanding of what their potentials were and what their works they could accomplish in particular. So, he thinks long fingers, gesture towards an ability to kind of pick cotton more efficiently. And at the same time, it's obviously a very famous book. I was reading roughly and kind of going through and thinking through Michel Foucault's The Clinical Gaze, which uh, people who read the book, it's not a theory-heavy book, but this was certainly an idea that very much informed me. So on the one hand, the enslaver is analyzing the outside of the body and the body in particular to understand a certain kind of labor potential. And for Foucault, the clinical gaze is much more about seeing potential or understanding disease on the inside of bodies from the outside of bodies, but connecting internal conformation, both anatomy, but in the case of Foucault, he's thinking more about pathology, of how specific diseases become visible on the outside of the body. So it's these two different optics, both trying to understand kind of the potential of the body, the connections between the inside and the out, the essence of who this person is, and their health, their abilities, and so this is in a lot of ways what I argue is like the context of the kind of moment of the emerging medical school and the kind of theory of polygenesis as a scientific race concept, but then the clinical racial gaze is how it's applied. So polygenesis, this third node here, is the notion that, roughly depends on which racial scientist you're talking to, but generally speaking, we'll say there are five different human races that were actually different species created by God distinctly in different parts of the world. So each human species in this kind of theory had different, we might say, strengths and weaknesses from even as it's obviously a very racist, white supremacist idea in this concept, the black body, enslaved people's bodies, you can read them for their ability to be agricultural laborers, much in the way the enslaver does in the slave market. But the addition of the clinical gaze is this ability to study the body, ability to study anatomy, and connect what we might think of as this almost like folk knowledge of the enslaver interpreting the body to a scientifically rigorous conception. I mean, I should put scientifically rigorous in scare quotes, but in the concepts of the moment, a scientifically rigorous conception of racial difference. So these two ideas make the physician in a way that's quite different from beforehand, a scientific expert on race. In some ways, you might say, not that necessarily planters always bought this, but a scientific expert on enslaved labor, on the health of enslaved people. Um, and so these kind of two clashing ideas, or not necessarily clashing, two complementary ideas, are really what form a new way of looking at racial difference that will transform dramatically in the next several centuries. And I know we're going to talk a little more about this later, but creates this notion of the physician as racial expert. The physician is someone who can analyze a racialized body, talk about its chief health concerns that are specifically racial. So this gets to this concept that Josiah Nott uses called malarial climates. So once you have these locked in bodies that are racialized in this very specific way, and not only and racialized as being enduringly different, enduringly distinct, not changeable, not kind of malleable by climate, which would have been a more Enlightenment framework, but is permanently distinct and having permanent relationships with distinct climates also. So a malarial climate, in a some sense, it's kind of intuitive. It's a climate where there's going to be more malaria. I mean, but it also is generally speaking another word of saying tropical climates, tropical places. And these are places that are quote unquote healthy for people of African descent. You know, we can get into later the fact that obviously people of African descent were getting malaria, and that the kind of inherited protections to malaria that do exist are not confined just to sub-Saharan Africans. But people are getting sick from malaria, but white people are, it's argued, are kind of harmed by these climates, and for people of African descent, they're kind of remarkably protected from this. And you also do see this showing up in political documents, like the Mississippi Declaration of Secession says that kind of by a remarkable fortune, only people of African descent can work in the fields in Mississippi. So it kind of repositions itself back in the politics after going through the kind of the filters of medical thought and medical ideology. But yeah, that was really those two works were very transformative to me, particularly Johnson, Soul by Soul, talking about the slave purchasing process, and Foucault.
Thank you so much. That's a really fascinating kind of line of thinking. So so I work on South Asia and I see a lot of, there's this book called Climates and Constitutions by Mark Harrison. So like in the earlier phase, people still believe in some kind of an idea of seasoning, and then gradually the racial ideas get more hardened and stratified. But at the same time, Indians are put into a lot of different racial categories. So some are understood to be as, diseased or lapsed Caucasians or Aryans, and then some are more closer to, proto-Australoid or Aboriginal, etc., etc. So how they assess different groups of Indians' potential for different kinds of labor in malarial conditions. That's fascinating. Um, yeah. My next question is about, your really powerful argument, which is kind of might seem counterintuitive to a lot of people, that racial science was part of what you call a national medical discourse. So it's not a Southern discourse per se, rather a lot of the premier medical schools in Philadelphia, a lot of the students, the majority of them are Southerners. So, while in the northern states the slavery has already been abolished, they are teaching a racial curriculum which is useful or applicable to these southerners. A lot of them are also enslavers. So how do these different kind of contexts, one that of a plantation, the other that of medical school, and the north and the south, kind of work together to create this discourse?
Yeah, so there's a both a kind of elitism, pragmatic aspect that's not so different than education, people going to universities today. But first and foremost, we'll say that the Northeastern medical schools were the oldest. They were the first founded. The University of Pennsylvania, the first three medical schools were what we now consider Ivy League institutions. the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, Harvard Medical School. So that in and of itself, they kind of constituted the internal, what we might think of as metropole compared to the southern states, because the most elite people went and studied in Europe, went and studied in France in the 19th century, went and studied in Edinburgh in the 18th century. And so the secondary, so the most elite people would first go to what we think of as an Ivy League institution and then go to Europe. If you couldn't do that, it was still pretty good to go to Philadelphia. You had many of the things we were talking about, the clinical racial gaze. What made that so powerful, or what gave so much prestige to the physicians who were really thinking through the clinical gaze in Paris, was they had big hospitals with thousands and thousands of hospital beds. Philadelphia didn't have that, but it had a lot more than Charleston. Philadelphia had more than New Orleans. Same with Boston, New York. These are urban spaces with hospitals. So you had more practical experience. So in just a basic sense, they already had a leg up. People had a kind of prestige and practical reason to go to medical schools in the North. But that wasn't necessarily enough. Boston was too far. So Harvard really struggled to get medical students during this period. The University of Pennsylvania was half Southern, half Northern. We know from letters that Harvard medical professor John Collins Warren in 1823 wrote the Boston Board of Health asking for help getting more cadavers because he thought it would attract more students from the West Indies and more students from the South. Um, so first and foremost, these institutions, they get paid per student. It's a customer-facing version of medical education in a way that is not quite the same today. So literally, like by the 1850s, Penn has around 400 students a year. That is just 400 individuals paying that professor for a lecture ticket every year. So that professor makes a lot more money if he gets more students, in a way that, of course, students, that somewhat still functions in the economics of higher ed, but is a lot more complicated today. So that, in its most simple sense, has something to do with it. But it's also that these northern medical schools, both for their own set of reasons, but also to have a pedagogy that's relevant to Southern students, talk about race and talk about slavery regularly. So I found, first we were talking about anatomy a little bit earlier. The anatomy curriculum is where you see most, I don't want to say rigorously, but maybe most systematically incorporated in. You can see discussion of difference in cranial capacity in pretty much every textbook, starting in the 1830s. It's very common in these anatomy textbooks in the United States. And these anatomy textbooks are also being written by prominent medical professors who also make money by assigning them to their thousands of students. And so they will talk about differences like things like John Collins Warren told his students that people of African descent had longer forearms than white people, and that this essentially resembled the gorilla in his words, these differences. So in this basic sense, teaching racial science was partially about attracting a customer base. You can also see discussions of slavery and slave management in medical schools. One medical student in his notebook at the University of Pennsylvania noted a kind of common concern for plantation physicians and enslavers themselves was the notion of feigning illness. And this is something that still exists in workmen's compensation claims and in workplace labor, is you need a doctor to verify that you're actually ill if you want to get time off work. That was similar on the plantation, but obviously much more extreme. So there was always a fear that enslaved people were lying about being sick and using their claimed illness to get out of work. And so the student noted in his notes an example given where a Virginia enslaver dug a grave in the middle of a field during a outbreak of some sort of illness. Supposedly, a great number of enslaved people on the plantation had the chills. That's all we know. But he said the next person who complains of being sick will be buried alive. And according to the student in his notes, this, was a very successful approach. But what you're seeing is both there's this anatomical kind of idea of racial difference that's critical to the just generally the fabric of anatomical thinking in medicine in this period, but then also engaging in what it will be like for half of their Southern students to go be Southern physicians, to be working on plantations. And then one final note, we should also note that Northern states had abolished slavery, but that does not mean that they didn't have their own kind of racist regimes. So another kind of critical aspect of this is, so if tropical regions, and we'll say subtropical regions, which is such a weird term, or the South, which is supposedly a climate that's better for people of African descent, although, of course, Delaware and Pennsylvania share borders. So, what's so different about those two places is a bit of a, not doesn't have a lot of scientific coherence there. But they argued that just as black people were healthier in the South, they were sicker in the North, particularly pneumonia. So, a justification that Professor Daniel Drake, who teaches at the Medical College of Ohio, Transylvania University Medical School, and the Louisville Medical Institute, now the University of Louisville Medical School, writes a letter that's kind of published in a leading newspaper, a series of three letters in 1851, arguing for colonization of free black people. In other words, sending free black people, and we should say back in scare quotes, to Africa. Most of them probably weren't born in Africa, but sending them back to Africa on the basis that they could not, both for social reasons, but for medical reasons, exist in free states like Ohio. Drake, considered himself not to be pro-slavery. What we think of that, what that meant is very ambiguous. But the point being is a lot of white Northerners, it should be no shock, were pretty racist themselves, didn't want to coexist as equals with people of African descent, and had also their own set of reasons for supporting this racial science.
Bernardo, do you have any question given how you also in your work talk about how race is a constituent part of tropicality?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in this part of your work in which so you mentioned how the South is understood as good enough for African Americans or people of African descent and good enough for whites. I'm really interested because I'm really interested in I don't know if through your research you gathered how especially whites um, grappled with the subtropical or the tropical, with all the political cultural implications beyond the climate. Being that also they were very much rooted in the land, I would say.
It's an interesting question. It's something that I'm always kind of going back and forth with and rethinking because at its core, the tropics, the subtropics for these people, in a lot of ways, whatever they want it to be in a given day. Um, and it doesn't, like, I was just writing about something for an essay, but this essay by James Henry Hammond, who is a senator from South Carolina, deeply interconnected with the kind of racial science set, at least through the background, like a good friend of Josiah Nott. But he writes an essay in the Southern Historical Quarterly in the 1850s. I'm not sure the exact date, but this is in the late 1850s. They're in the process of a lot of these Southern elites are advocating for, he actually advocates in this essay for planters to take their enslaved people to Brazil. After the Civil War, there will be kind of Confederado villages in Brazil of people who actually flee. But he's arguing that this kind of synchronicity between white overseers and black workers in particular, even in Brazil, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. Why that's similar to Virginia or South Carolina, even, um, would essentially be able to kind of build Amazonia into a great plantation district. But then later in the same essay, he also advocates for Oregon to be made a slave state. In what planet could
Yeah,
Oregon be considered anything akin to a tropical climate? So I think one of the difficult problems with this kind of research and these ideas is that there are, I don't want to say good faith racial scientists. There are people who have like a set of beliefs. Um, but things like tropical, things like even blackness, of course, are so situationally deployed. And in a way to where you can have such an extreme contradiction of saying this kind of combination of white white managerial skills and black workers can clear Amazonia, but then we're never going to stop the expansion of slavery. It's going to be in Canada. It's not going to be, it's like Canada. I'll give them, it's going to be in California. It's going to be in Oregon. All these places that, I mean, I don't want to say there's some sense in California. There were cotton fields. Shout out to the great Merle Haggard country song, California Cotton Fields. It does become a cotton state, but it's not a tropical climate at all. And so I think the real core of like what is a tropical climate, there's a scientific explanation, but in a lot of cases, it's where are these things like dengue fever, yellow fever, malaria. But then sometimes in one essay, that whole concept can go out of the window and be still part of a kind of Southern expansionist narrative for turning Oregon into a slave state. So it's really, in some ways, a bizarre. It means whatever somebody needs it to mean in that exact moment, because I've never seen anybody advocate for abolition of slavery in Delaware and Maryland on the basis that it's too temperate, or Virginia for that matter. It's so I think there's a real to put it mildly, they're pretty loose with their definition of tropicality. But it has something to do with the types of diseases people get, something to do with how hot it is, um, but not always. But usually, it's these hot places with these tropical diseases, whatever
Yeah.
that means in the moment.
Yeah. I see. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, there is this really interesting article published in Lancet in late 19th century, which declares that Calcutta has become more temperate because now a lot of British people reside there and they're cultivating the space. So a city which is for all practical means and purposes extremely tropical that can also become temperate in some ways if it has a certain kind of racial constitution. So I think even in the British imperial world, the kind of what is tropical and what is temperate that can vary a lot. Um, yeah,
It seems like it also has to do with the white people living there and how they want to think about the place they're living in and
yeah,
their civilization status.
yeah. So I was really fascinated by how you are, you were talking about these kinds of legal things, anatomical museums and their collections. Um, So it has sort of different scales in which race is mapped within the school, the larger kind of national discourse, some transnational medical networks, professional networks, and also then later more imperial and global kind of applications or expansions of certain ideas of race. So how did you come up with kind of that narrative arc for the book, and does it any way help us understand um, how race functioned for these people, or how some of these medical students understood race in a more multiscalar way as well?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I'll say that book's been out for a few years, but I've never been asked this one before, and I really appreciated getting to think about it because I first wanted to draw out these kind of structural changes to medicine that I think are I'm probably, could be accused of a structural determinist, and I wouldn't have much of a lawsuit on my hands. But first and foremost, the Enlightenment is this moment where we see a transition from discussing race in kind of colonial contexts in very contradictory, haphazard ways to the first relatively systematic studies of racial difference. And all of that we should always put in scare quotes. And so on the one hand, you have these emerging race concepts, but they're still very nascent. Most of the racial theorists are not polygenous. They believe that race is relatively transient, can be changed through, essentially having sex with people who look differently than you and living for long periods of time in different climates. The Comte de Buffon, for example, said that, wind had turned people in Central America a darker color. So the climate has something to do with it in this theory. But the most important point is we're starting to have some sort of systematic studies of race. It's drawing in physicians already, people who we don't think of as being doctors. Carolus Linnaeus is, the first systematic taxonomist in Europe, or the most prominent one, a physician. Petrus Camper, the first person to study facial angles, a physician, an anatomist. So there's a lot of overlap between who are doctors and who are these Enlightenment figures. And then second, you have the emergence of medical schools in the United States. There are a couple hundred medical students who graduate from medical schools in the 18th century, less than 300. There are nearly 30,000 who graduate from 1840 to 1859. So these two kind of structural shifts are really critical for understanding, in my opinion, why this moment is so particular, and also why maybe, and I say maybe because I feel like the British medical schools and the French medical schools are pretty racialist too, but why there might be something a little bit more, something a little bit unique about the American character of the story. is that kind of moment of not having medical schools beforehand, but also having this emerging slave society or this growing slave society in the age of abolition also. So there's a need to defend slavery. Um, so I wanted my readers to really understand that basis, this transition from a humoral medicine to empirical medicine of the body, of the clinical gaze, of the rise of these institutions, and of critical analysis of race in a moment when slavery is under attack. But then, and that's in the middle of the book, I really wanted you to kind of experience, for lack of a better word, what it was like to be a medical student and its racial components. So you start with dissecting, and literally in the most intimate ways, handling people of African descent's bodies, cutting them open, penetrating them with knives, like quite literally, um, and trying to then both understand them as diseased objects, things to map your sense of anatomy onto, but also as racially different. So even in this early phase, the black body has a kind of contradictory position. And then some students even experimented on enslaved people in some quite disturbing ways, although that was much rarer. Um, and then I wanted to take you through the curriculum of anatomy. So students would learn about racial differences in textbooks first, and that's very passive in a lot of ways. But then you sit in on a lecture, and I do include these pictures I think are pretty critical, where you realize that the 19th century anatomy lecture is a kind of visual feast. Images of it are covered, the wall behind the physician in these sunken amphitheaters, covered in bones, illustrations of bones. And I've seen kind of accounts from Harvard Medical School about this as well. So it's not just this one painting we have from Britain. Um, the physician would literally be kind of have bones laid out in front of them as they lectured on anatomical differences. And perhaps they even might have passed human remains around the room. And so that's your kind of second level, is experiencing this as a student sitting in a lecture. And then potentially you might go into the anatomical museum. Certainly every student went in at some point into the medical museum and the anatomical museum. And anatomical museums were full of racially kind of racialized objects. A British physician, the first really systematic anatomical pro-polygenesis author, Charles White, who writes, I think it's either in 1799 or 1801, his book on racial difference. But he says, you don't really have an anatomical museum. This is quite a disgusting quote, but if you don't have a person of African descent's penis in it. Like that is, even at the turn of the 19th century, considered a kind of almost assumed part in Britain of having an anatomy museum. But then you also have skull collections. At Harvard, they had roughly 150 human skulls technically by 1870, but it's these three collections that already existed in Boston that students would have had access to in the antebellum period. And these were organized hierarchically by race, to where a kind of ancient Greco man or Greek man would be on some level considered the same race as a modern Austrian. I mean, those are two examples from the book. Um, and then on the bottom of this kind of hierarchy are skulls of African descent, and then other racial groups in between. So students there could potentially measure the skull. We know that Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. actually donated his craniometer to the medical school when he retired. So students could handle human remains, touch them, feel race with their hands, measure racial difference for themselves. And then finally, they might write about it. So that whole section is really about drawing you through that this was something that was drilled into your head through what you might think of as active learning, not just a kind of passive education. And so then the final section is really about what do these ideas look like? And this is that, again, I think that connection between the clinical racial gaze and the malarial climate kind of idea is you take these ideas of raised bodies, but then you have to go out and practice. You have to work on a southern plantation. You might also just be the most scientifically knowledgeable person, or at least reputable person, whether or not we think they're reputable, in your neighborhood. And somebody says, well, what do you think about racial difference? What do you think about polygenesis? What do you think about climate? Um, and the physician would give their opinion. Uh, uh, and so kind of following the doctors out in the world in this last section as almost a physician, even as we're still really relying on their writing a lot. And then the other thing I think that's here is in this last section is the way that physicians were really looking out at the world in certain ways. These racial ideas are very much, of course, rooted in the kind of fractious politics of the antebellum period, where that will end in a gigantic civil war, the most violent war in U.S. history. But the U.S. is also a burgeoning empire. I mean, we don't think of land empires anymore, but I don't know I'm in California right now. I work in Nevada. These are places that are essentially being conquered through wars with Mexico, through wars with indigenous people during this time period. So these climatological and racial ideas are being used to justify that, but also justify the US's kind of imbrication in a global system of imperialism. And this has quite practical effects and brings me to the one chapter that I would say is not really adopting a student perspective. And that's a chapter on racial skulls and imperialism that both tells how, and I think we're going to get to this in a little bit, but medical schools relied on empires to get these skulls, but also tells the stories of people whose skulls were collected. So looking back kind of from an outsider perspective at the medical school as well, to maybe provide a counter narrative and jolt us out of this white student gaze that is a lot of what the book's written through.
Yeah, that's an amazing, I think, narrative arc, and it reminded me of there was this anatomical study of the skull of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was a diplomatic emissary from the Mughal Empire to Britain, and he was also, writing books which were very much in dialogue with a lot of Enlightenment philosophers. So they called him the Black Aryan. So like this person is not white, but at the same time he is kind of part of the Enlightenment discourse. So they literally studied his skull to like what kind of a thought can come out of the Black Aryan or something like that.
Really fast. Does James Poskett write about him? Sorry,
I,
maybe.
yeah, I think I have read it by in the writing of like Ishita Pandey, who is a. I can send you the book in an email. But yeah, but that kind of also made me think about all of these skull collections. They are not only of people from African descent, right? So there are opium wars in China, and slavery was in Brazil. So a lot of different skulls of different races are coming into these collections. So, you mentioned briefly, how there is a relative absence of thinking about or the medical constitution of indigenous Americans in medical schools as opposed to this hyper focus on blackness and so on. And I know that Bernardo also wanted to ask something along this line. So, Bernardo, if you would like to chip into, so like how these different races are constituted within these, anatomical museums or even kind of skull cabinet or something like that.
Yes, I mean, my interest in this is because in my research, which is from an anthropological lens, I'm an anthropologist, I do ethnography, and I tried to go a bit into the archive, a bit into history too. But I'm interested, as I said, in tropicality, but vis-a-vis Latin America. So the relationship between how does tropicality merge in the US, particularly the US South, through the relations with Latin America. So in your book, you do mention how what are some of the ideas in relation to Native Americans. But I wonder if you found or you came across more about both Native Americans or also peoples in the rest of the Americas. Besides, for instance, what you mentioned about the man from the slave revolt in Brazil, for instance.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, and I'm gonna come back, Suvendu, to your question. They're connected, but there may be the Native American question. I think in some ways takes us in a, not off path, but a little bit different connection. So one of the really fascinating, and it's something I've worked on a bit since the book came out. And I just actually had an article in the New England Journal of Medicine about the physician John Collins Warren with colleagues at Harvard Medical School. And Warren is a skull collector. He assembles what's called the Warren Anatomical Collect Museum now, named after him. He was the anatomy professor at Harvard in the antebellum period for most of it. Um, and he has a theory that ties together the indigenous Americas, we'll say. And it's a broader theory that He never connects these dots, but he does. I think a intelligent person could see how this could very easily justify expropriation of indigenous land on a mass scale. But so he's very obsessed with architecturally advanced indigenous civilization. So particularly Incas, Aztecs and Mayans, Central America, and the mound building slash Mississippian societies in the greater Mississippi Valley in North America. These all, for the most part, are united to some degree, although I think he's a little bit weird in his methods, for sure, to put it mildly. But in his mind, by skull compression, by the kind of compressing of the skull to create what are sometimes offensively called, and so I want to make that clear, flat-headed Indians. But he argues, and this also gets to an interesting kind of the position of South Asian people in this literature, that the original Native Americans were South Asian migrants across the Bering Land Bridge, who were, as Suvendu was kind of hinting, always in this ambiguous place, especially in the United States. They're a little bit more clear in their racism in Britain. In the US, people, Hindus and Muslims from that region can end up being in the Aryan category with whites, or can be in very different places. But he argues that these kind of first wave of migrants across the Bering Land Bridge found all these advanced civilizations. And these are weird things. So I feel like you should be smart enough to know that this doesn't make any sense on the timeline. But then a second wave of kind of migrating Asians, not from South Asia, more, I think, say in the kind of steppes, Central Asia and Mongolia regions, come in a second wave, essentially overtake these regions through, process of conquest and war, and that those are really the people, the descendants who they're dealing with in places like Massachusetts, but also for the most part, even in other parts of the Americas at that point. So you can see kind of two different arguments there. On the one hand, these people are all migrants, just like us, or settlers, like us, just like us, in this kind of worldview. And the people we're dealing with conquered the actually civilized indigenous people. So it deals with this kind of weird, how do we grapple with these complex indigenous civilizations that are architecturally interesting, that are worth subjecting to archaeology in this period and obsessing about, without, even having to entertain something like that maybe we shouldn't be here. Maybe we took somebody. So that's where, in a lot of ways, the indigenous people fit into this. And then I think for in cases like the Brazilian enslaved Brazilian rebel, and he's in the papers at Harvard, he's called a leader of what's the Malay Revolt, the Muslim Uprising, depending on where you call it. It's this very famous revolt in Brazilian history in 1835, arguably the largest slave revolt in Brazilian history. And he's described as a leader, although João Jose Reis, who's like the preeminent scholar of this and a professor in Brazil, has said it's unlikely based on his research that he actually was a top level leader. He might be a street level leader. Um, but the short of it is how they looked at him as another African. I mean, that's like one of the really, I mean, this gets at what the real fundamental flaws are of the race concept. In that man was a Malay, a person who was almost certainly born in West Africa, but a person of African descent who might have by this point, been in the United States for 6 generations, potentially been intermixing with Europeans for a long period of time and look completely different. These are the weird conversations we have to have when discussing racial science, but that they and this man who was literally born in kind of the Yoruba land, Hausa land regions of West Africa near Nigeria, that they are one and the same, essentially. So those are these really bizarre um, ways in which I think for the Americans, he's just another skull to be added to and he's fetishized for his story, that man, as being a enslaved rebel from Brazil. But in terms of this kind of tropicality, it gets back to this real extreme looseness in the way that they use these concepts to where, you know, in Josiah Nott, when he's talking about these malarial climates, which is another kind of word for tropicality, that's like the lowlands of the South. If you live up on a hill, you're no longer in a malarial climate, which is, somewhat true. I'm not a great. I'm not too knowledgeable about insects, but I know enough to be dangerous. And so, but this also kind of gets to this broader premise of what's so fascinating about these skull collections in these museums. And I think this gets back to the other question is there's a very circular relationship. And I early on thought of it as like these people, and they sometimes there's a great book by Sonia Shaw called The Body Hunter, so that name has always stuck with me. But let almost like a hunter, wasting nothing, is that these remains, these conflicts that are being created around the world in this period, whether it be a slave revolt in Brazil, settler colonialism in Southern Africa. I really focus in on a young man whose life is completely disrupted by settler colonialism in Southern Africa, and comes to Boston in a P.T. Barnum exhibit, takes his own life, and ends up in this skull collection. Um, but that on the one hand, these remains exist and are accessible because America, well, Europeans in particular, but also increasingly Americans, exist all over the world. And when you all of these people, these physicians, colonial and imperial bureaucrats, they come from the missionaries, they come from the same class, the same families. These are what we might think of as a burgeoning American professional class with obviously tight connections to economic elites. So for every colonial war that happens, there's usually some sort of American businessman. There was a lawyer in Brazil who collected that skull of the rebel. There was a lawyer there. When Stormont, the young man from South Africa, he after traveling from the west coast of Southern Africa to the Indian Ocean coast of Southern Africa, he meets up with an agent essentially of P.T. Barnum, who brings him into this exhibit in the United States. Samuel Morton, who's kind of famous for collecting the largest collection of human skulls in the U.S. and potentially in the world in this period. I don't sometimes called the American Golgotha after the kind of site in the ancient world where in Israel and Palestine today, where people were executed, where Jesus was hung on the cross, and all these remains were. But his collection, he relied on this man, George Glidden, who is an English-born, but the American vice consul to Egypt. That guy, got hundreds of skulls likely for Morton. Certainly, at one point he says he had more than 90 skulls in his house, where he was hiring local people to tomb raid Egyptian monuments, ship him things from the Red Sea, from the Indian Ocean world. So all of these people kind of placed around the world are able to tap into these conflicts, which then create these collections of human remains, which are then measured, subjected to statistics to create these racial categories, and then justify the very same processes of kind of imperializing the global tropics, the global south, all the different euphemisms that we still, in some ways, exist today to describe either hot and cold places or poor and rich places. Um,
That's so interesting. It almost kind of makes me think that if you could like write a second book only based on the movement of these anatomical body parts, a kind of a post-human history of sorts. Uh, yeah, so like the anatomical museum is a kind of a very direct object oriented space which carries the afterlife of slavery, but there are other kinds of afterlives that you talk about as well. We have a 2016 study that suggests that medical students still believe that black people don't get that much pay and so on. So how do you read the afterlife of slavery in current modern medical system, and what is the role of a historian in redressing or addressing these issues?
that's a great question. So first, I'll just say that I think of race as fundamental. What it is an ideology in the Marxist sense of the word. And I really look to people, scholars like Barbara Fields, Karen Fields in their great book, Racecraft. And I subject my students to defining ideology and introduction to African American studies every semester. But ideology is like, and race in this way is like a misleading map to understand health, differential health outcomes. In our context of the 19th century enslavement, but it also works this way in the 21st century. So the most troubling and most, in my opinion, damning kind of structural remnant of this period is the notion that race as a biological category, is a determinative factor in health outcomes. And that using racial categories that, with just a little bit of scrutiny, make no sense as broad markers of biological difference that can be used to explain differential health outcomes and even justify different treatment regimens. So when we look at this in the 19th century, and this is something I've been working on and kind of teasing out a little bit more clearly in some essays lately, is on the one hand, you'll have physicians on plantations. These are people who will produce a lot of the racial science we're talking about. They'll say things like, people of African descent thrive in malarial climates, as we've been talking about. Yet, when you actually drill down into what they're talking about, you see a whole host of fevers, intestinal ailments, that not to mention gynecological issues that enslaved people are suffering routinely. Of course, cholera epidemics were devastating in this period. Yet, some physicians claim that people of African descent fared better when they got cholera or dysentery. Some other physicians also, who maybe couldn't bring themselves to say that, said that people of African descent's panic caused them to have a worse outcome with cholera or dysentery. But either way, what you're seeing is either a blaming of the body, you're either ignoring the problem in one case, you're blaming the body in another case, or you're blaming the actions of people who are essentially victims of unhygienic conditions, of cramped living quarters, of having no privies in this period, having not even an outhouse, or not even necessarily at that level on most plantations. And so this kind of gives the planter a pass on the constructed quarters, the living conditions under which people live in. In the case of gynecological ailments that were so common, James Marion Sims famously did to some degree create a surgical cure for vesicovaginal fistulas, or did with help of enslaved nurses. Um, and the idea, though, was that this was some sort of peculiar problem for enslaved people, but enslaved women were at high rates of malnutrition and high rates of rickets. These two things cause more difficult births. There was also a great deal of pressure to have many children. So the kind of racialized claims of Black women's fecundity, about their insensitivity to pain, mask a deeper truth about how the material conditions that these people live in create their health problems. And we can see this in very much the same way in the present. Even in COVID-19, we saw this in the Journal of American Medical Association very early in the pandemic. To be fair, this was a preliminary study, but a preliminary study of health outcomes from COVID, particularly related to certain gene expressions in respiratory illnesses. And this has also been used as a justification to say that Black people have a genetic predisposition to asthma. So they're kind of building on that research. But they use Latin Hispanic people as a racial category, which could be 100% European person, or essentially 100% person of African descent, or a person of 100% indigenous descent. So first and foremost, they're just using these categories that are truly bizarre. But then you go study people who are people of African descent. We know they're in the United States, are African Americans, more likely to experience poverty, more likely to have to be in what we would call frontline workers in the COVID era. There are a whole host of material reasons to presume that those folks, for class, race, and how those two things intersect, gender, can shape what kind of interactions you have, your health outcomes, but it's through the social determinants. What race does is take away a need to address those social determinants. Race says it's your body, it's your behavior, if it's a more culturalist version of race, that is causing you to be sick, that is causing these kind of statistical expressions of health disparities. And what's the answer to racial health disparities? More genetic medicine, more individualized medicine, maybe even, and Dorothy Roberts has written about this, and there's a famous one, Bidal, this heart disease pill geared at Black people, racialized pills. Now, what does addressing the social determinants of health cost? It require. What does it require? It requires maybe fixing people's housing. We've seen this in these kind of abundance debates. of we need to build housing as quickly as possible and cut through the red tape. Now, I'm not going to say I have any answers for this, but one of the examples they always give is in places like Los Angeles and Southern California, they want to build housing, public housing and affordable housing near the interstate. Well, to do that and meet code, you have to put in better kind of basically air filtration systems that are more expensive. And they want to take away those regulations. Well, if we blame race for the high rates of kind of racialized minorities for having higher rates of asthma, then that seems fine. The better filtration system has nothing to do with it. But if you blame the fact that these people are having interstates built through their neighborhoods, which we know historically happened, for higher rates of asthma, then you have to address that. You have to address the structural and material ways in which our society is unequal, which is a lot more expensive, isn't particularly profitable for the major profiteers of our healthcare system. Maybe a better way of saying not profitable at all. And also ask some really deep questions about the nature of American inequality, the kind of persistence of racial disparities in material life that are not, can't be blamed on genes, can't be blamed on even epigenetics, which is an interesting kind of future field. I have, not 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 sure how I feel about it yet, but it's certainly an interesting field of inquiry. But at the end of the day, it takes us to actually actionable things we could do, but require us to think about a different type of United States, a different type of society, a different approach to health that takes the whole body, the community, the places where people live into effect, which is not as profitable, harder to deal with in some ways. Um, and so to me, race makes the health disparities we have seem inevitable and unfixable as social problems. And but it's a faulty map. It's a faulty roadmap at the end of the day. It does rhyme. It makes sense from a certain perspective because there are racial disparities. They're just not caused by biology or racialized biology. Yeah, so that's where I see it most critically. Of course, universal healthcare would also be helpful in fixing these disparities, but making sure that people are existing in the roughly similar conditions in terms of their environment and then receiving similar care uh, uh, would be the major solutions to a non-race-based explanation for health disparities. Uh,
Thank you so much, Chris, for that really eloquent answer. So I will stop recording here.